I built the model. That is the thing I need to say first, before anything else, before any explanation or context or the careful professional language I would normally use to describe my work. I built the model that produced the number, and the number was 100%. And I stood in front of the Imperial War Council, and I said the number out loud, and I believed it, and the council believed it, and the fleet was deployed on the basis of it, and the fleet did not come back. I built the model. I am the one who should explain what went wrong. Not because anyone has asked me to. The council has not asked me to explain anything. They have been somewhat preoccupied with the consequences of what happened, and I have not been a priority. But because I am a mathematician and I have spent 40 years believing that understanding what went wrong in a calculation is more important than any outcome the calculation was meant to produce. And I am going to apply that belief to the worst calculation of my career, even though applying it is one of the most uncomfortable things I have ever done. I am going to explain as precisely as I can why 100% was wrong. Not just wrong in the way that probability estimates are sometimes wrong, not wrong in the way that a 95% confidence interval is wrong 5% of the time, wrong in a more fundamental way, wrong at the level of what the number actually meant and what I thought I was measuring when I produced it, wrong in the way that reveals something about the limits of the kind of thinking I have spent my career doing. I owe that explanation to the people who acted on the number. I owe it to myself. And I think I owe it, though this is harder to articulate, to the humans, because understanding why we were wrong about them is a form of respect that failing to understand would deny them. Let me describe the model, because the model is where the error lived, and I cannot explain the error without first explaining what I built. The Imperial Probability Framework for Conflict Outcome Assessment, which is the formal name of the system I have spent 20 years developing and refining, is a mathematical model that takes as inputs a set of variables describing two opposing forces and their operational environments, and produces as output a probability distribution over possible engagement outcomes. The variables include what you would expect: force size, weapons capability, defensive capacity, supply line integrity, command structure quality, territorial knowledge, response time metrics, and approximately 240 additional factors that 2 decades of model development have identified as relevant to conflict outcome. The model is, by the standards of the field, very good. In the 43 engagements for which I have been asked to produce probability assessments during my career, the model's predicted outcome has fallen within the model's stated confidence interval 41 times. An accuracy rate of 95.3% over 43 engagements is, by any professional measure, exceptional. The Imperial War Council trusted my model. They had good reason to. I trusted my model. I had good reason to. The 2 engagements where the model's prediction fell outside the confidence interval were both cases where post hoc analysis revealed data quality issues in the inputs, not flaws in the model itself. My model had never been wrong about the model. And then I applied it to the humans, and the model produced 100%, and the 100% was the most wrong number I have ever produced, and the wrongness was not in the data, and it was not in the calculation, and it was not in the confidence interval methodology. The wrongness was in what I was measuring. The wrongness was in my assumption that what I was measuring was the thing that determined the outcome. I want to explain what 100% means in the context of the Imperial Probability Framework, because it does not mean what it sounds like it means, and the gap between what it sounds like and what it actually means is part of the story of how I got here. In probability theory, a probability of 1 or 100% means certainty, means an event that will occur regardless of any other factor. In the framework, 100% does not mean this. The framework operates with a resolution limit, a minimum detectable probability, below which the model treats outcomes as effectively impossible. The resolution limit is currently set at 0.01%, 1 in 10,000. When the model produces 100% for an outcome, What it is technically saying is that all alternatives to that outcome have a probability below the resolution limit, meaning they are not literally impossible but are sufficiently unlikely that the model treats them as functionally equivalent to impossible. In practice, in 43 engagements over 20 years, the model had never produced 100% for any outcome. The highest it had previously produced was 98.7. When I ran the human engagement parameters and the model returned 100%, I ran it 3 more times with different random seeds to check for computational artifacts. The model returned 100% all 3 times. I ran a sensitivity analysis, varying each input parameter by its estimated uncertainty range, to see if the 100% was robust to input variation. It was. Across the entire plausible input space, no variation produced an outcome probability for Imperial victory below 99.4%. I had, in 43 engagements, never seen anything like it. I reported it to the council as the most certain outcome assessment the framework had ever produced. I was not wrong about that. I was wrong about what the framework was actually measuring. The inputs that produced the 100% were individually accurate. I have checked them against the post-engagement data and they were accurate. The human fleet size was correctly measured. Their weapons systems were correctly characterized. Their defensive capabilities were correctly assessed. Their supply line integrity was correctly evaluated. Their command structure was correctly mapped. Every one of the 244 variables I fed into the framework was, to the best of my ability to verify after the fact, an accurate representation of the thing it was supposed to measure. The inputs were right. The calculation was right. The 100% was mathematically correct given those inputs, and the fleet did not come back. Which means the inputs were right, and the calculation was right, and the 100% was correct, and the outcome was wrong. And the only explanation for that combination of facts is that the inputs did not measure the thing that determined the outcome. I have spent the months since the engagement's failure trying to identify what the inputs failed to measure. I have not arrived at a complete answer. I have arrived at a partial answer that I believe is correct, and the partial answer is uncomfortable in the specific way that partial answers are uncomfortable when they reveal something not just about a single mistake, but about the foundations of the approach that produced the mistake. Here is what the 244 variables of the Imperial Probability Framework measure. They measure what forces have, and where they are, and how quickly they can move, and how much damage they can absorb, and how much damage they can deliver, and how well they communicate with each other, and how thoroughly they understand the terrain. These are the inputs to a conflict. They describe the resources that enter an engagement and the conditions under which those resources operate. They are the right things to measure if what determines a conflict's outcome is which side has more of them and uses them more efficiently. They are incomplete measures if what determines a conflict's outcome is something that enters the engagement not as a resource, but as a quality, not as something that can be inventoried before the engagement begins, but as something that manifests in how each individual decision within the engagement is made. The framework has variables for command structure quality and command response time. It has variables for unit cohesion and coordination efficiency. What it does not have, what I do not know how to build a variable for, is the thing I have been circling for months without being able to name precisely. The closest I can come is this. The framework measures what forces can do. It does not measure what forces will do when what they can do is not enough. I have reviewed the engagement records extensively. The Imperial fleet entered the engagement with every advantage my model indicated it possessed. The human fleet was outgunned, outnumbered, and by the framework's assessment outclassed in every measurable category. The engagement began as the model predicted it would begin. The first exchanges of fire produced outcomes consistent with the framework's projections. For approximately the first 20 minutes of the engagement, the model's predictions and the actual engagement data were close enough to identical that I could have used either to describe the other. And then something happened that the model did not predict, and that I do not know how to predict even now, having watched it happen. The human fleet, which had been absorbing losses at a rate consistent with the model's projected outcome, stopped responding to those losses in the way the model expected. When a force absorbs losses at a rate that the model projects as leading to inevitable defeat, the model expects the force's behavior to begin adapting toward the preservation of what remains, toward limiting further losses, toward either seeking an exit from engagement or attempting to concentrate remaining force for a final decisive effort. The human fleet did neither of these things. It continued doing exactly what it had been doing before the losses began accumulating, with the same tactical decisions and the same commitment of resources and the same operational tempo, as if the losses were not a variable in its decision-making. And it kept doing this past the point where the model expected rational actors to change behavior, past the point where the force concentration ratio made continued engagement statistically suicidal, past the point where I would have, watching in real time, expected any force to accept the logic of the situation and begin adapting to it. They kept fighting as if the losses did not change what they were there to do. And because they kept fighting when the model expected them to stop, they kept doing damage when the model expected them to stop doing damage. And the cumulative damage they did when the model expected them to stop was what changed the outcome. I spoke with a human academic after the engagement. I sought the conversation myself, because the question I was carrying could not be answered by the engagement records alone, and I needed to ask it of someone who might know the answer. The academic was a professor of military history at one of the human universities, a woman who had spent her career studying the history of human conflict, which is a long and extensively documented history with more material in it than I could read in a lifetime. I explained what I had observed in the engagement records. I said, "Your fleet continued offensive operations past the point where the probability of achieving a positive outcome, by any reasonable calculation, had fallen below any threshold I would normally associate with rational military decision-making. I want to understand why." She thought about this for a moment, and then she said, "What threshold do you use?" I said, "The threshold at which continued engagement produces more expected loss than expected gain." She said, "And you think that threshold should change behavior?" I said, "It changes behavior in every other force I have ever modeled. Every other force I have data on, across 43 engagements in 30 years, modifies its behavior when the expected value of continued engagement becomes negative." She nodded as if this was an interesting observation rather than a challenge. She said, "I think the issue is what you mean by expected gain." I said, "I mean the probability-weighted outcome value of the engagement, which declines as losses accumulate and the force concentration ratio shifts against you." She said, "Right, and for most forces that calculation is the relevant one, because what they are trying to gain is the engagement itself." She paused and then said, "Humans in a fight are usually not trying to gain the engagement. They are trying to gain the thing the engagement is for. And the calculation for that is different, because the thing the engagement is for does not go away when your force concentration ratio shifts." She elaborated for 2 hours and I took notes, and I have been thinking about those notes for months. The core of what she said, stripped of the historical examples she used to illustrate it, was this: human military forces are not, as a rule, deployed with the objective of winning an engagement. They are deployed with an objective that the engagement is meant to serve, and the relationship between winning the engagement and achieving the objective is, in human military thinking, a conditional relationship rather than an identity. You can achieve the objective without winning the engagement. You can win the engagement without achieving the objective. The engagement is a means, not an end. And when the probability of winning the engagement becomes very low, a human force does not necessarily conclude that the objective is unachievable, because the objective's achievability depends on the objective, not on the engagement's outcome in isolation. She gave me an example from human history, a ground engagement in which a human force that was numerically and materially outmatched held a defensive position far past the point of rational military calculation, not because they thought they could win the engagement, but because holding the position for a specific period of time served an objective that the engagement's outcome did not fully determine. She gave me another example, and another. She said, "This is not unusual in human military history. It is actually quite common. We fight past the point where the engagement is winnable when we believe that what we are fighting for is achievable, and those are different calculations." I sat with that for a long time. Then I said, "My model does not have a variable for what you are fighting for." She said, "No. I suspect that is why it produced 100%. I said, "How do I build a variable for it?" She was quiet for a moment. "Indeed," then she said, "I do not think you can. I think what you are describing is the part of the calculation that is not a calculation. The part of the calculation that is not a calculation. I have been a mathematician for 40 years. I have spent those 40 years believing, with the conviction that competent practitioners in any quantitative field eventually develop, that everything relevant to the questions I was asked to answer could be measured, and that the quality of my answers depended on the quality of my measurements and the sophistication of the mathematical relationships I used to connect them. This belief has served me well. It has produced a model with a 95.3% accuracy rate over 43 engagements. It has given me a career and a reputation, and the trust of the Imperial War Council. And it has produced the worst error of my professional life, because I applied a framework designed to measure what forces have to a question whose answer depended on something that forces carry with them that cannot be inventoried before the engagement begins. The professor was right that I cannot build a variable for it. I have tried. I have spent months trying. Every operationalization I attempt either measures something that is already captured by the variables I have or collapses, under examination, into a tautology. Forces that fight past the rational threshold do so because they fight past the rational threshold. The thing I am trying to measure is the reason they cross the threshold, and the reason is not, in any operationalizable sense, a measurable input. It is, as she said, not a calculation, and my model, which is a calculation, cannot contain it. What I can do, and what I have been doing in the months since the engagement, is revise the framework's confidence ceiling. The framework currently allows outputs up to 100%, treating outcomes with all alternatives below the resolution limit as effectively certain. I am revising this to cap outputs at 95% for any engagement involving a species designated as conflict experienced, a category I am proposing to define based on historical data about how a species has behaved in past engagements when facing materially unfavorable odds. The cap is not based on a model of what the remaining 5% represents. It is based on the honest acknowledgement that there is a category of input that my model cannot measure, that this category is more present in some species than others based on historical evidence, and that the appropriate response to a known measurement limitation is a corresponding limitation on expressed confidence. 95% is still a very high confidence level. It is higher than I am honestly comfortable expressing for any engagement involving the humans, given what the engagement records show. But it is the level that the framework's historical accuracy justifies as a ceiling for measurable factors, and flagging the remaining uncertainty is the most honest thing the framework can do with what it cannot measure. I presented this revision to the Council last month. The Council was not interested in a revised confidence ceiling. The Council was interested in how quickly a new fleet could be assembled. I told them I would not be providing a probability assessment for a second engagement. They asked why. I said, because the last assessment I provided for an engagement with the humans was 100%, and the engagement did not produce the projected outcome, and I believe the reason is that my model cannot measure the relevant inputs, and producing a second number that I cannot honestly defend would be professionally irresponsible and would not serve the council's interests or the empire's. There was a silence. Then one of the council members said, "Can you produce a number for us?" I said, "I can produce a number. I can produce any number you would like. The question is whether the number will be true, and on that question I must tell you honestly that I do not know, because the thing that determined the outcome of the last engagement is not something my model can see." The council did not appreciate this answer. I did not expect them to. Councils generally prefer numbers to the acknowledgement that numbers have limits, because numbers feel like control and limits feel like its absence, and people in positions of authority have a reasonable preference for control over its absence. I understand this preference. I do not share it, because 40 years of building models has taught me that the illusion of control produced by a number you cannot honestly defend is more dangerous than the discomfort of acknowledging what you do not know. The 100% I gave the council was a true number in the sense that it accurately reflected what my model could see. It was a false number in the sense that it implied a certainty about the outcome that my model had no basis for implying, because the outcome depended in part on something my model could not see. The fleet went into the engagement believing they faced a 100% probability of victory. I do not know whether that belief changed how they fought. I do not know whether a fleet that believed it faced a 60% probability of victory would have fought differently, would have been more cautious, more adaptive, more prepared for the possibility that the engagement did not go as expected. I do not know. What I know is that the human fleet that faced my 100% probability of imperial victory fought as if they believed a different number, as if whatever calculation they were running produced an output that made continued engagement rational past the point where my model expected them to stop, and that the thing making continued engagement rational in their calculation was the thing I could not measure, and the thing the Council's second fleet will also not be able to measure against, and that the number I would give the Council for a second engagement would be another number I cannot honestly defend. I want to say something about the humans that is not about the model and not about the engagement and not about the professional consequences of producing a number I cannot defend. I want to say it because it is true, and because saying true things is what I believe in even when the true things are inconvenient, and even when the person who needs to hear them is myself. The humans fought the way they fought because they believed the thing they were fighting for was worth fighting for past the point where the fighting was rational by any external measure. The thing they were fighting for was not abstract. The engagement occurred in the orbital space of one of their established systems, a system containing several billion people. They were fighting for the people in the system. Not as a strategic objective, not as a resource to be protected, but as people, as the specific individuals living the specific lives that existed in that system, and that would not continue to exist in the same form if the Imperial fleet achieved its objectives. The human fleet knew this. I know they knew it because it is documented in the communication records from the engagement, the messages the fleet transmitted to the system's population, and to their own command structure during the fighting. And those messages make clear that the people in the system were not an abstraction in the fleet's decision-making but a presence, a specific and continuous presence, that shaped every choice made during the engagement. They were not fighting a military engagement with a system as the prize. They were fighting for the people, and the people were real to them in a way that the framework's variables do not measure and cannot measure, and the realness of the people was what made the fighting continue past the point where the framework expected it to stop. I cannot build a variable for that. I cannot put it in a model. But I can say clearly what it is, which is that the thing my 100% failed to account for was not a military capability or a tactical innovation or a technological advantage. It was that the humans knew who they were fighting for, and the knowing made them something that my model had no category for. A force that would not stop until the reason to stop was larger than the reason to continue, and where the reason to continue was the lives of billions of people, The reason to stop was not going to be a force-concentration ratio. I am 61 years old. I have 30 years of productive work left if my health holds, perhaps more. I have decided, in the months since the engagement, what I want to do with those years. I am going to continue developing the Imperial Probability Framework, because the framework is useful, and because 95.3% accuracy over 43 engagements is genuinely good, and because the thing I failed to account for does not invalidate what the framework does account for. But I am also going to spend a portion of my remaining career studying the specific question of what the framework cannot measure, not with the goal of eventually measuring it, because I have become convinced that goal is not achievable, but with the goal of understanding it well enough to know when its presence in a situation should cause me to lower my expressed confidence regardless of what the model produces. The professor of military history was right that it is not a calculation. But not being a calculation does not mean it cannot be understood. Humans understand it. They have been writing about it and studying it and arguing about it in their military histories and their philosophical traditions and their literature for thousands of years. And I have access to that material, and I intend to read it, and I intend to come out the other side of reading it knowing something I do not know now, something that is not a vari able and not a coefficient and not an input to any model I have ever built. But that is the difference between 100% and the truth. I owe that to the council, whose fleet did not come back on the basis of my number. I owe it to the profession I have practiced for 40 years, which is the practice of honest quantification of uncertain things. And I owe it, in the way that I said earlier is harder to articulate to the humans, because a species that fights the way they fight for the reasons they fight deserves to be understood, and producing another number I cannot honestly defend about them would be a failure of that understanding that I am not willing to commit twice. The Empire calculated a 100% victory probability. The Empire never ran a second calculation. I intend to understand why before I run another one. There is a postscript to this account that I did not intend to include, and that I am including because it happened this morning, and because it is relevant in a way that I think belongs here. I received a communication from the professor of military history with whom I spoke in the months after the engagement. She said she had heard that I was writing an account of my analysis and its failure, and she wanted to offer a source that I might find useful. A human text on the philosophy of quantification in conflict, written approximately 2 centuries ago by a human mathematician who had spent his career building models not unlike mine, and who had arrived at the end of that career at conclusions that she thought I might find resonant. She sent me the text. I read the relevant section this morning. The human mathematician had written, in the final chapter of his last published work, that the fundamental error of quantitative conflict analysis was the assumption that the outcome of a conflict was determined by the resources that entered it. He wrote that what actually determined outcomes was the relationship between the resources that entered a conflict and the reason those resources were committed to it, and that the reason was irreducibly human, irreducibly particular, irreducibly present in a way that any model general enough to be useful would necessarily fail to capture. He wrote that the correct response to this limitation was not to abandon quantitative analysis, but to be honest about what it showed and what it could not show, and to reserve the highest confidence levels for situations where the part it could not show was small. He wrote that when the part it could not show was large, the quantitative answer was a beginning, not a conclusion, and that treating it as a conclusion was the most reliable way to be surprised by the outcome. He wrote this 200 years ago. He was a human mathematician, which means he was writing about human conflict, which means he had access to the historical record of how humans fight and why, and he reached this conclusion from that record. I am a mathematician of a different species, and I reached the same conclusion from a single engagement, at the cost of an imperial fleet and everyone on it. I am not certain whether it is humbling or clarifying that the answer was already written in the language of my own profession, by a human who understood his own species well enough to put into mathematics what I required a catastrophe to see. I think it is both. I think that is appropriate.